Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the warm welcome to Knowle. I don't think I've ever been to your church physically. I wonder if you'd do me a favor. I can only see a few faces. Now, you don't have to show your face all the time, but it would be good just to see if you would dare to just put your camera on just for a little while. I'll just say good afternoon to you. Let me see who's here. Get a little idea of who Knowle is and who the people are. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. You don't have to keep your camera on. It's just to get a sense of who it is I'm speaking to. It can be a little bit of a challenge, you know, when you're just speaking to a screen. Thank you very much. Thank you. I am going to share my screen now, so I'll be just having a few slides so that you can all see those. Hopefully you can see that screen right there. I was invited to the young adults group at my church a little while back, and they gave me the topic of identity to speak about. I could speak about anything as long as it had to do with identity. So I decided I was going to speak about Adventist identity. Gathered in a room with about 25 young adults, and I started off by asking them, what is it that makes Adventists different to other Christians? I wonder what you would answer to that. Well, somebody put their hand up and said, well, we keep the Sabbath. I said, yeah, that's true. We definitely do. But we're not the only ones that keep the Sabbath. Actually, there's a whole nation of people that keep the Sabbath. So that doesn't really make us that different. Well, somebody else said, we believe in the second coming of Jesus. Correct, I said. But most other Christians believe in the second coming of Jesus, and even Muslims believe that Jesus is coming again. So in that sense, it doesn't really make us that different. Okay. Somebody said, well, we've got Ellen White. And I had to agree with them. It's true. Nobody else has Ellen White, or only Adventists do. But many other Christians and other groups have their own prophets or prophetesses. So in that sense, we're not that different. Well, eventually somebody said, well, we preach the three angels' messages. I said, okay. That's good. So can you explain to me, what are the three angels' messages all about? And there was silence. Nobody could really tell me what the three angels' messages were about, until one person said, a little bit jokingly, we're against Catholics? Is that what it means? And I said, no. The three angels' messages does not mean that we're against Catholics. And then we went on to have a really good discussion together. But I came away from that meeting thinking, you know what? I think there's a lack of clarity about who we are as Adventists. And if we aren't sure about who we are, we will not be sure about what our mission is meant to be. So I decided that I was going to write 3 sermons based on the three angels' messages. And so today I'm going to preach for you the first angel's message. Now, before you switch off and say, oh, no, not that again, just bear with me. I think you will hear this in a way that you've never heard it before. So just bear with me. So our mission as Adventists is meant to be this. Let me show you what our mission is meant to be. If you go onto our official website, let's see if I can get this to actually move forward. This is our official website. The Adventist mission, the mission of the Adventist Church, is to make disciples of Jesus Christ, who live as his loving witnesses and proclaim to all people the everlasting gospel of the three angels' messages in preparation for his soon return. When's the last time you spoke with somebody about the three angels' messages? Well, if you're in Sabbath school today, you would have talked about it this week because it was in this week's lesson. But when did you share with somebody else the three angels' messages? You know, often when we've had the three angels' messages explained to us, they're filled with lots of historical details, etc., and we get lost in it. So most of us aren't able to explain what they're about. So I decided, okay, if I'm going to write some sermons on this, I'm going to have to change the way this is normally done. So I decided to look at who is the best teacher, Jesus. And how was it that Jesus taught? His method was to do two things. Jesus used summaries and he used stories. Summaries, yes. One time he was asked, what is the greatest law? Because there's lots and lots of different laws, and Jesus summarized them all, and he said, the greatest law is to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Another time, he summarized the whole of the Old Testament as this: do to others as you would have them do to you. So how would you summarize the first angel's message? Let me read it to you again, just to remind you what the first angel's message is. Revelation 14, verses 6 and 7. And it says, and I'm reading from the New International Version, then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. He said in a loud voice, fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water. How would you summarize the first angel's message? Well, here's my summary. Judgment is good news. That's how I would summarize the first angel's message. Now, of course, the question we have to ask ourselves is, now, why should this be proclaimed to every nation, tribe, language, and people? Why should we tell everybody on the planet that judgment is good news? I'd like to suggest two very quick reasons. Number one, religious people need to know that judgment is good news. You see, the idea of divine judgment is the thing that produces the most fear in religious people, especially if they have the idea of this eternally burning hell. I think for Adventists, the idea of the judgment is what fills us with most insecurity. Let me read for you from the SDA hymnal. I don't know if you can see this, most likely out of focus. Hymn number 416. This is just the first verse and chorus. 416. The judgment has set. The books have been opened. How shall we stand in that great day, when every thought and word and action God, the righteous judge, shall weigh? How shall we stand in that great day? How shall we stand in that great day? Shall we be found before him wanting, or with our sins all washed away? I mean, as you read that, you kind of get this sense of insecurity. I'm not sure. How are we going to stand? And you see, that's the problem. That's the point. How shall we stand in that great day? That's what it's asking. And so for religious people, I think we need to hear that judgment is good news. But I think also for non-religious people, they also need to know that judgment is good news, because I think within the minds of non-religious people, that's what produces most rebellion in them. They do not want to have anything to do with a being that says, obey me or I'll kill you. For example, the actor Brad Pitt, he grew up in a Christian home, and he said once in an interview, the reason why he turned away from Christian belief and he's now an atheist, he said, for me, a big question to me was fairness. If I'd grown up in some other religion, would I get the same shot at heaven as a Christian has? In his home, he was taught that only Christians will make it to heaven. All the others will be judged not to make it to heaven. So for him, he just rejected the whole thing. Aaron Rodgers, an American football player, he also grew up in a religious home. And he turned his back on the whole thing as well. And he was interviewed once and asked, why is it that you no longer believe in God? And he says, I don't know how you can believe in a God who wants to condemn most of the planet to a fiery hell. because that's what he hears from Christians. If you don't believe in God, you're going to end up being burnt. So I think non-religious people need to hear that judgment is good news. So I think the first angel's message is God's way of saying, listen, let me clear this up once and for all. Judgment is good news. That's the summary. Judgment is good news. Remember, there's two parts to Jesus' teaching methods. Summary, but also stories. Jesus was always telling stories. We know that. He told parables constantly. Why was he always telling stories? Neuroscience tells us that our brains are wired for stories. We're always telling children stories because they remember them. We all remember stories. Actually, most likely the only thing you remember from this sermon are any stories that I tell, because our brains are wired to remember stories. But also, the reason why stories are important, because we as Adventists, we read the Bible as a big story. We call it the Great Controversy. There's this big war going on in the background that's playing out in the background. And so because we read the Bible as a story, we understand that there's this war going on between Christ and Satan over the character and the government of God. And so that's why judgment is good news when we understand it in terms of this great controversy story. So, what story could we use to illustrate that judgment is good news? If you have your Bibles, turn with me then to John chapter 8, because that's where we're going to concentrate our thoughts today. And we had that read for us for the scripture reading. It's a very well-known story that we have. But I think in this story, we can find 4 reasons why judgment is good news. The first reason. Who is it that's on trial? You know the story. Jesus is teaching. The religious leaders bring in a woman and say she was actually caught in the very act of adultery. As you look at the scene, you think, yeah, okay, we can understand this now. And they say, now the law tells us that we should stone people like this. What do you say? It seems pretty straightforward, right? Jesus is the judge, the woman's on trial, and he has to make his judgment about her. But notice here then, John chapter 8, verse 6. What does it say there? John chapter 8, verse 6. It says, they were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. Notice here, we tend to think it was the woman that was on trial, but actually it was Jesus that was on trial. What's his decision making going to be like? Will he uphold the law or presume to set up his own law? The case was designed in such a way that no matter what he said, he would be condemned. But notice, it's Jesus or God's Son or God himself that's actually on trial. And you know what? When you understand the great controversy, you'll realize that God is the one on trial, not us. That's what's so fantastic about the judgment being good news. It's good news because God is on trial, not you and me. That's a central idea in the great controversy. Somebody's raised doubts about God, and so he's put himself on trial before the whole universe so that they can make up their minds about him. And so when you read the Bible with that in mind, then you realize in the Garden of Eden, it was God and his decision making that was on trial. When you read the book of Job, it was God and his decision making that was on trial. When you read the Old Testament prophets, you hear God constantly defending himself like he's a defendant. For example, in Jeremiah 2, he says, what accusation did your ancestors bring against me? What made them turn against me? It's like God is trying to defend himself. Why? Because he's the one on trial. And you come to the New Testament and you read what Paul says in Romans 3 verse 4. It says, let God be true and every man a liar, as it's written, so that you may be proved right when you speak and prevail when you are judged. The great controversy helps us understand that sin and salvation aren't primarily about us. It's primarily about God and his character and his reputation. And so when you read in the first angel's message, the hour of his judgment has come, don't think it's the hour of him judging us. It's the hour of the universe judging him. And that's why when you read the judgment scene in Daniel chapter 7, and there are thousands upon thousands and thousands of beings there, it's because they are making up their minds about him. And that's the first reason why judgment is good news, when you understand it within the great controversy context, because God, not us, is the one that's on trial. For religious people, I think that's really good news. It means that we can just relax a little bit. We don't have to be so uptight and be giving God this fear-induced obedience. For non-religious people, I think this is a much more attractive picture of God. I think they would be attracted to the picture of a God who's willing to put himself on trial before the whole universe because he wants to win us back to trust in him. So that's the first reason why judgment is good news, because God's on trial, not us. But the second reason why judgment is good news is when you think about, well, how then are we judged? How are we judged? You notice in the story here, that Jesus bends down and he starts to write in the ground. And they press him until he says something, and then once he says, "Whoever's without sin, cast the first stone." Let's read what it says then in verse 9, here in John chapter 8, verse 9. It says, "At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there." Do you notice? They judged themselves. It's really interesting when you notice the theme of judgment in the Gospel of John. It's really absolutely amazing. Very quickly, John chapter 5, verse 22. This text in itself is really good news, but there's more than this one. So John 5:22, this is Jesus speaking. He says, "Moreover, the Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son." I mean, we could just stop right here. God doesn't judge anybody. The Father doesn't judge anyone. Do you see that? You believe what Jesus says. The Father does not judge anyone. He's given that to the Son. Okay. So we're in the hands of the Son. But if you go back to chapter 8, verse 15, here's what Jesus says. "You judge by human standards. I pass judgment on no one." Did you see that? The Father doesn't judge anybody. He's giving that to the Son. The Son says, "I don't judge anybody either." What? So how is it that you and I are judged then? We judge ourselves. We all know John 3:16, right? "For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shouldn't perish but have everlasting life." But when you read on from there, verse 17, it says, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned. But whoever does not believe stands condemned already, because he's not believed in the name of God's one and only Son." This is the verdict. This is how you come to a verdict, it says. "Light has come into the world, but men love darkness instead of light, because their deeds were evil." Do you notice here in the story, light is Jesus. And Jesus just says, "Okay, if you're without sin, throw the first stone." And what happens? They, because their deeds were evil, because they were trying to trap Jesus, they condemned themselves. That's how judgment works. We condemn ourselves. It's all based on how we respond to the light that we have. In other words, our future, our destiny is in our own hands, depending on how we will react to what we understand about Jesus. And it's always so much better to just allow people to make up their own minds, judge themselves. I remember when I was a pastor at Newbold, I used to have Bible study groups with people. And I remember this one group I had, there was a number of young adults there. And this one young lady, what I would do is we would get a story and get them to read different parts of it. So this time we were reading the story of the woman at the well. And this one young lady, it was her turn to read, and she read where Jesus told this woman, "You've had 5 husbands, and the one you're living with now isn't your husband." And as she read that, she said, "Oh." And then we carried on. After the Bible study, I called her aside and I said, "Hey, what was that reaction when you read that there?" And she said, "You know what? I have just, my boyfriend and I, we've just bought a house. We're living together. But from what Jesus says, living together is not the same as being married. So I've got to go back to him and talk to him about being married." I was completely amazed. I mean, I hadn't spoke to her about that whatsoever, but she judged herself based on what she understood Jesus to be saying. We judge ourselves. Now, okay, listen, I know some of us are really good at self-condemnation. We're constantly putting ourselves down and judging ourselves. We need to remember what Paul says in Romans 8. Remember, if God is for us, who can be against us? Who can bring any accusation against us? Nothing can separate us from God's love. So some of us need to remember that. But because God is on our side, it means that we control our own destiny. The only one that can keep us out of heaven is ourselves. If we choose against God, if we choose against Jesus, if we choose darkness instead of light, if we choose death instead of life. That's why Moses, when he was summarizing for the children of Israel in Deuteronomy, he says, "I put before you life and death, blessings and curses. So now choose life, because the choice is in our hands." So the second reason why judgment is good news when we understand it in this great controversy context is because we judge ourselves. We control our own destiny by our own choices. For religious people, this is good news. We don't need to be unsure about our standing with God. You know, some of the most depressing and saddening times for me was when I went to visit church members on their deathbed. And I've had it happen a few times where people looked at me with fear in their eyes and said, "Pastor, do you think God will judge me worthy of being in heaven?" I mean, they're about to fall asleep in death and they're still unsure about their standing with God. We don't need to be unsure because we control our own destiny. If you have chosen Jesus, you have chosen life. For non-religious people, I think this is a much more attractive picture of God. I think they could be attracted to a God who allows us to judge ourselves, who allows us to determine our own destiny, and who doesn't threaten us into compliance. The third reason why I believe judgment is good news in this story is when you think about what is God's main objective. What is God's main objective? You read in the story that Jesus bent down and wrote in the ground twice. Now, why did he do that? What was he doing? He's writing in the dust. You see it in verse 6. He bent down and he wrote in the ground, and they kept pressing him. And then he says, "Okay, if you're without sin, cast the first stone." And then again, verse 8, he stooped down and he wrote on the ground. Why was he doing this? You know, most commentators say that he was most likely writing their sins in the ground with his finger. What was Jesus doing? I think Jesus was trying to save them, because his main objective is always to save. Jesus was trying to preserve their self-respect and dignity. He wasn't trying to humiliate them or expose them, even though they were his enemies. He was trying to save them. See, I know, and I'm sure you would have been tempted, wouldn't you? If I knew this bunch of guys was coming to me to try and trap me, I would have exposed them. I would have said, listen, the law says that you should bring both the man and the woman. So where's the man? And that would have just sent them packing. But Jesus wasn't like that. He was trying to save, because Jesus is in the saving business, not the condemning business. So he wrote in the dust. And if he's writing their sins in the dust, they can walk by easily and just rub it out as they walk by. But notice, this is God writing with his finger. And that should remind us of a couple of other times when God wrote with his finger. Remember, he wrote the 10 Commandments in stone so that they would never be erased. He wrote on the wall in Belshazzar's feast, never to be erased. And here he could have written their sins on the ground, never to be erased, but he only wrote it in dust, because he's in the saving business, not the condemning business. And you see this all the time in the life of Jesus. Remember the time he was invited home to Simon the Pharisee, and a woman starts washing his feet, and Simon starts thinking, man, if this guy was really a prophet, he would know that this is a sinful woman. And what does Jesus do? He doesn't expose him. He just tells him a story to let him know, I know what you're thinking. Why? Because Jesus is in the saving business, not the condemning business. And look at how he treated Judas, the one who was going to betray him. Even at the communion, it's like he served him first, like he was the honored guest. Why? Because Jesus is always seeking to save. He's in the saving business, not the condemning business. You know, I remember my teachers at school when I was younger, they like to just humiliate you as much as possible. I remember we had one teacher would come with our homework books, and if the homework wasn't good, she'd just start throwing them across the room, and you had to get out of your chair, really embarrassing, go and pick up your book. That's not the way Jesus was. He was never trying to oppress or humiliate his enemies. And you know, we should have understood this a long time ago, because there's a whole book in the Bible called Judges. And do you know what the job description of a judge was? Let me just read it for you very quickly. This is Judges chapter 2, verse 16. It says, then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Judges were saviors, because God is in the saving business, not the condemning business. And that's the third reason why judgment is good news, because when you understand it within this great controversy, God's main objective is to save, not to condemn. And even if you are his enemy and you reject him, he's still seeking to save you, and he will not reduce your self-dignity and self-respect. He's trying to preserve that as much as possible. For religious people, I think, you know, we can never, ever need to be afraid again that God will ever shame and condemn us. God is not judgmental. And maybe if we worshipped a God that wasn't judgmental, it would make us less judgmental. It always saddens me every time I read statistics that are done when they interview non-Christian people and ask them, what is your main impression of Christians? Judgmental is always one of the top 3 things that they put in there. Why is that? Most likely because most of us worship a God that we think is judgmental. But when we realize that God is not judgmental, he's not in the condemning business, he's in the saving business, maybe that would make us as Christians as well less judgmental. And I think for non-Christian people, non-religious people, this would be a much more attractive picture of God. Maybe they would even be attracted to a God whose main objective is to save rather than condemn. And even if you choose against him, he's not going to bully or humiliate you. What a God. That's the third reason why judgment is good news, because his main objective is to save, not to condemn. But then the fourth and final reason why judgment is good news. What does his posture say about him? How have you imagined the final scene of this story? I've looked online at what artists tend to picture. Many of them picture Jesus standing over the woman and she's cowering in the dust. And he's saying, neither do I condemn you. But when you read the story, it's actually quite surprising. Look again. John chapter 8. Notice verse 2. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered round him, and he sat down to teach them. You know, if we were in the church together, I would get you all to stand up and then I would sit down. Because that's the way you used to teach in Jesus's day. I think I will tell the pastor that when you go back to the church, throw out all the chairs and only have one chair, and that's for the preacher. Then nobody will ever fall asleep in your sermon again. But that's a different point. But this is the way Jesus used to do it. The teacher would sit and everybody else would stand. So he was most likely sitting on the steps of the temple. He's the one sitting and everybody else is standing around him. And then notice, it says, verse 3, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery, and they made her stand before the group. So they put her right in the front of everybody, because everybody's standing up, so everybody can see her. So she's standing there closest to Jesus, and everybody else is looking. And then, of course, you know how the rest of the story goes. Jesus writes in the dust, bends over, writes in the dust, straightens up a couple of times and says some things. So the final scene is with Jesus sitting at the feet of the woman. Notice that. Jesus is sitting at her feet. That for me, that picture just says volumes about God. He's like a Cinderella God. He's the one who's willing to take the humble position in order to lift us up. He's the one that's willing to be the most humble servant in order to lift humanity up. I believe that God is the most humble being in the whole of the universe. Remember, Jesus says the greatest in the kingdom is the greatest servant. Who do you think is the greatest in the kingdom but God himself? And that's why I think it says in Micah 6 verse 8, what is it that the Lord requires of us? To do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. Why walk humbly? Because God himself is humble. And that's why Jesus could humble himself and wash 12 pairs of dirty feet. The fourth reason why judgment is good news, when you understand it in this great controversy context, is because God portrays himself as always humbly willing to do whatever it is to lift us up. For religious people, I think maybe we need to sometimes replace the image of this condemning God sitting on his throne with a picture of a God kneeling in humble service of you and me. What would that do to us? I think that would melt our hearts and make us worship God, like it says in that first angel's message. Worship God with a whole heart that is just bursting with gratitude for a God like that. For non-religious people, I think this is a much more attractive picture of God, that they would most likely be attracted to the picture of a God who humbly serves us. So basically, what I'm saying to you is, when you share the first angel's message, just remember, the summary is judgment is good news. That's what you want to tell everybody. And what you want to do is tell them a story. Tell them this story. The reason why we as Adventists want to preach that judgment is good news is because we understand there's this big war going on. Judgment is good news because God is on trial, not us. Because we control our own destiny. We judge ourselves. So our destiny is in our own hands. Judgment is good news because God isn't in the condemning business. He's in the saving business. He's not trying to humiliate us. He's seeking to save us and preserve our dignity and self-respect. And fourthly, judgment is good news when you look at this story because he portrays his character as always willing to humbly serve us. Let me close with perhaps my favorite quote from Ellen White from the book Christ Object Lessons. It says, "It is the darkness of misapprehension of God that is enshrouding the world." The thing that's covering our world, the thing that's oppressing us is the fact that most people misunderstand who God is. She goes on, "Men are losing their knowledge of his character. It's been misunderstood and misinterpreted. At this time, a message from God is to be proclaimed, a message illuminating in its influence and saving in his power. What is this message? His character is to be made known. The last rays of merciful light, the last message of mercy to be given to the world is a revelation of his character of love." That's what the three angels' messages are about. That's what this first angel's message is all about. It's that message that needs to get out there. Let's tell people about God's amazing character of love. Judgment is good news. But perhaps the greatest illustration that judgment is good news would be the woman herself. Can you imagine if we could have interviewed her afterwards? What do you think she would have said? I mean, after, getting over the shock, and you meet her a few hours later, I think she'd be just brimming and just dancing up and down with joy. She would be saying, judgment is good. Of course it is. Judgment is good news because I'm walking around alive. Jesus got both himself and me off the hook. He didn't condemn me. He sat at my feet and set me free. I'm going to worship him for the rest of my life. Now that's a story worth telling. Amen.